Well, she went in for a job interview, and everything was going well. And then he asked that one question. So tell me, what are your greatest strengths and weaknesses? Don't you hate that question? I mean, everyone, I think most people do. Most people don't like that question. I'm trying to get a job. So why do you want me to tell you what I don't do well? And so most people don't like that question. They try to downplay their weaknesses. Or they try and think of how to make their weakness not too bad. And some have even tried to follow that advice, we'll turn your weakness into a strength. And so they'll say something like, well, my weakness is that I can really only do one thing at a time. But that's because I'm really focused. And so it's actually a good thing, because then I see all the details and I don't miss things much. But everyone knows what you're doing there. But people tend to talk about their strengths. In fact, in life, people tend to even brag about their strengths. And people tend to try to hide their weaknesses. But then the Apostle Paul comes around and he turns the whole thing on its head. And so we might ask, do we have things backwards? Well, let's begin in chapter 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 16. I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. So Paul is going to brag a little again. He still feels very uncomfortable doing it. He's really embarrassed to do it because it's a foolish thing to do. In fact, he says to use this boastful confidence, as he puts it, in other words, that is to commend yourself or brag on your qualifications, is not something that Jesus would do. He says, I don't do it as the Lord would, but as a fool. It's something that a fool would do. You see, Jesus never bragged to defend himself. Oh, he could have. Oh, he could have said a lot of things about himself, who he was. But he never bragged to defend himself or to make people think highly of him. But Jesus was humble. And so Paul doesn't want to brag either. And he feels like a fool doing it. But he also feels like he has to in this situation. You see, they're forcing his hand because the Corinthians have accepted the false teachers based on their bragging of themselves. And so the Corinthians are foolishly evaluating people based on externals and worldly humanistic standards, as we've seen. But that means that they are impressed when the false teachers tell about their strengths. So Paul, he doesn't want to talk about himself, but he will meet them where they're at. And he will join in this foolishness in order to show that he's better qualified than the false teachers. And why is he doing that again? We've talked about this. It's so they will accept that he, not the false teachers, but that he, Paul, is the true apostle of Jesus. And that this is important so that they will listen to the truth rather than the false teaching. Verse 19. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. So here Paul's saying he assumes that they will put up with his being foolish and with his boasting because they're wise. And they gladly bear with fools. Okay, Paul's using a little sarcasm here. He's pointing out an irony. You see, they accept the false teachers based on foolish criteria, but they think when they do it, they're being wise. because they think it's wise because they're following the standards of the world. They're not thinking spiritually. But Paul shows how what they're doing doesn't really make sense. Now, before we get onto that, let me mention this. It's also ironic here how Paul makes this point. With the sarcasm, with the statement here. He's using Greek rhetoric. The things that they thought he should have been doing, because that would be wise, that would be strength. So Paul is actually, and Paul yet called it foolishness. And so he says, so he's speaking the way the Corinthians value, but he's being foolish to get through to the foolish Corinthians. And so he goes on to point out that their so-called wisdom, what their so-called wisdom has gotten them. They've put up with these foolish braggers. And the result is that they have accepted the false teachers. And as a result of accepting these false teachers and putting up with their bragging, they have fallen prey to these false teachers' deception and to their control. You see, the false teachers, they came in and just took over. Now, ironically, Paul had been accused of overexerting his authority, but it's actually the false teachers who have come in and made the church in Corinth their slaves. So Paul says that they've abused and exploited the church for their own benefit. They've arrogantly exalted themselves because they think they're really important. And they've taken control of the Corinthian believers, and they have used them. And lastly, he says that they've allowed the false teachers to hit them in the face. Now, most likely this is figurative, but he's saying that they've let the false teachers mistreat and insult them. But they've put up with it because they think they're being wise. They're following the standards that the world sees as wise, but in doing so, they've acted foolishly and allowed the false teachers to take advantage of them. Verse 21. To my shame, I must say, we are too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Paul says, I'm too weak for that. He's saying that he has never taken advantage of them. In fact, he's done the opposite. Earlier in his letter, what did he say? He said that Paul is the Corinthians' servant. Not that they are his slaves, but that he is their servant. He's taken no money from them. He's put no hardship on them, and he's given them the gospel freely. He hasn't insulted them, but he actually loves them. And he says, and God knows it. He hasn't tried to benefit himself, but to benefit the Corinthians. Now, again, Paul uses rhetoric to make this point. Because remember, they accused Paul of being weak, of not being the same as the false teachers. And so Paul says that he is too weak to abuse them like the false teachers have. Well, Paul's so-called weakness has resulted in his not taking advantage of the Corinthian believers. He came in the meekness and gentleness of Christ. The false teachers, they called that weakness. But in reality, it was a Christ-like way of sharing the gospel with them and teaching the truth to them. But with all of this sarcasm, Paul is making a clear point. First, that which is considered weak by human standards is actually wisdom. And that which is considered wise by those same human standards is actually foolishness. The Corinthians and the false teachers have it backwards. That so-called wisdom has misled them and caused them to act like fools. But Since the Corinthians are evaluating their teachers by these foolish human standards, Paul will speak as a fool and will show that he is even more qualified to be an apostle than the false teachers who brag of their greatness. If this is what the Corinthians require, then he will comply. But he's very uncomfortable with it. So we've seen that when we follow worldly standards, we have things backwards. So in reality, what's more important? Well, Paul is going to start listing off his qualifications. He starts with some things that you might expect. Look at verse 22. He says, "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I." He's saying that he is a true descendant of Abraham. He was born and raised a devout Jew. The false teachers were as well, and apparently made a big deal about it. And so Paul starts by simply pointing out that he has the same qualifications that they do. But then, look at verse 23. It starts this way. "Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I'm talking like a madman." Now, so now he says, not only am I have those same things, he says, I'm better. And he will go on to defend this statement. But let's talk about this for a second. He says, are they servants of Christ? Well, we know the answer to that question because we've already read it. No, they're not. What did Paul tell us? They're servants of Satan. And so they're not. He's told us this, but at this point, Paul takes their claim at face value for the sake of argument. They say that they're servants of Christ, but Paul will show that he is a far better one. But wait a minute. Paul can hardly get those words out of his mouth. He finds this statement, I'm a better servant of Christ, to be a ridiculous statement. He says, I'm talking like a madman. See, as soon as he says it, he has to qualify it. It makes him so uncomfortable to make this statement. I'm talking like a madman. It's like Paul said it and then immediately thinks, I can't believe I said that. How foolish to make such comparisons. I'm talking like I'm crazy. But then he presses on. So continuing there in verse 23, he says, I'm talking like a madman. Then he says, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. At a night and a day I was adrift at sea. Okay, so he starts off this list with things showing how he was better than the false teachers. But as we read this list, something stands out to us. These are all bad things. This list of bad things can be seen in a couple ways. One, you can see it can be seen as a strength or a list of strengths because he did so much for Christ and endured so much in serving Jesus. But this doesn't seem to be Paul's focus here and in the rest of the passage. It could also be seen that all of this suffering also highlights Paul's own personal weakness. That he has repeatedly faced hardship and repeatedly faced trouble in his ministry. It's been hard. And this is the point that Paul will eventually get to. But for now, just notice the irony of it. Of that these bad things, this suffering, makes him a better servant of Christ. And so what are his qualifications then? He lists off these things. He says that he has worked harder than others. The work has been difficult. How? Well, let's think about some of the examples of what Paul did in his life. Just a few simple things. First of all, he left his home and went to a different culture, another culture, different than his own. He had to figure out how to relate to people in those cultures. And sometimes that was hard to do. He went to foreign places he had never been. He had to explain the truth to Jews who were skeptical at best, and who were also argumentative, and some who had just flat out opposed him and what he had to say. He also worked to support himself, and then did the ministry work on top of that. He also suffered all of the things on this list. He worked harder than others. Second, he says that he was thrown in jail for preaching the gospel more than anyone else. He was beaten many times. In fact, he says countless, which means it must have been a lot, enough that he's probably lost count. Next, he says that he nearly died many times. Then he says he received 39 lashes 5 times. Now, the 39 lashes, this is a whipping, where you whip someone in the back. But a whipping given to criminals in order to punish them. And it was done by Jewish leadership. So this was a Jewish form of punishment. The number of lashes would fit the crime, but the law didn't allow someone to be whipped more than 40 times, because that would be excessive. So the Jews would stop at 39 just in case they miscounted, because you wouldn't want to accidentally break the law. But this was an extreme beating, and it could bring someone near to death. Paul got it 5 times. Next, he says he was beaten with rod 3 times. Now, this was a Roman form of punishment. Now, the prisoner would be hit with sticks or long tree branches. And with Paul being a Roman citizen, it actually wasn't legal for him to receive this punishment. But apparently, he received it 3 times. And then he says he was stoned once. Now, normally, once is all that someone could be stoned, because this was a capital punishment. It was meant to kill the person. You threw rocks at them until they died. Now, we know of this incident from the book of Acts. Acts tells us they took him out of the city and they stoned him. They thought he was dead. They left him there. And then later, Paul got up and walked back into the city. Now, even though he wasn't dead, and I think sometimes we forget about this because we're so amazed by the fact that, he's not dead. He got up and walked back to the city. Even though he wasn't dead, he would have been severely wounded. In fact, it's amazing that he was able to get up and walk at all. And then he says that he had also been lost at sea and in 3 shipwrecks. Now, we know of one time from the book of Acts that Paul was in a shipwreck. It's not one of these 3, because this letter was written before that incident that's recorded in the book of Acts. So traveling by sea could be dangerous, as Paul well knew. But by the way, this list shows us that the book of Acts doesn't tell us everything that Paul did or everything that happened to the apostle Paul in his ministry. But he's not done giving us his qualifications. So now he gives us a list of dangers that he faced in ministry. Verse 26 says, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. In all his traveling, it seems he was in constant danger. Danger from nature, like overflowing rivers, or just simply trying to cross a river where there is no bridge. Danger from other people, like robbers, who would hide out along the roads and terrorize travelers. Or from many Jews, his own people, who didn't like him because he taught that Jesus is the Messiah. Also, danger from many Gentiles, who didn't like him because he taught devotion to Jesus and to reject the false gods of the Greco-Roman culture. Wherever he went, whether he was in cities, or if he was in the wilderness, or if he was at sea, there was danger. But he continued to serve Jesus in spite of it all. And then the last danger listed is that from false brothers. So even in the churches, there was danger, because fake Christians would attack him. And this would include the false teachers in Corinth. But these false brothers, they were not only a danger in the sense of persecuting or opposing Paul, but they were a danger to the ministry, to the truth of the gospel. They opposed the true gospel. They opposed true godliness. He continues on, verse 27. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. So he worked hard and faced many hardships. He often went without sleep. This could be because he worked late into the night, or maybe all night. We know of a couple cases of that. It may be just simply that he has thoughts and concerns for the churches, for the people on his mind that keeps him from sleeping. He says that he often went hungry. This may be because he was too busy to eat. It may be that he was in prison and they didn't feed you. It may be that he just simply had no food at times. In fact, we know that at times Paul was broke and had nothing to eat. How do we know that? From Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 and 13. He says, "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low and how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." And on top of those things, he also had times where he had no place to stay. He was just out in the cold. Verse 28. "And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to fall and I am not indignant?" So this list of physical suffering, well, that's enough. But the emotional concern for the spiritual well-being of the churches weighs even more heavily upon him. He cares deeply for these believers. He is concerned that they remain faithful to Jesus. And when another believer is weak, he feels it. You see, this is how it is in the church, where we are members of the body of Christ and therefore members of one another. And Paul says elsewhere that when one rejoices, we all rejoice. And when one mourns, we all mourn. You see, Paul here, he identifies with these believers and he cares for them in their struggle. And if another believer is led to sin, he feels the weight of that as well. It really bothers him when Christians fall into sin. He is truly concerned for their spiritual well-being, and he cares so deeply that when they struggle, they're on his heart and on his mind. and it affects him. And he says it's a daily pressure. In other words, it's a weight he carries all the time. It never goes away. It's always there. So is Paul saying here that weaknesses are more important than strengths? Well, he is holding up his weaknesses as a better qualification for serving Christ. He's looking at things a little different, and he'll keep explaining. So we might ask, well, is there a better perspective then? Look at verse 30. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. Okay, so now it's becoming a little more clear what he's doing. They have forced him to boast, so he's boasting, but not in the things that they would expect him to boast about. He's just listed off a bunch of occasions of suffering and hardship. This isn't Paul just having a martyr complex, like, oh, look at me, I've suffered so much. This is Paul turning the whole idea of boasting upside down. The false teachers, they bragged about their strengths and the things that the world values as important. But Paul focused on things here that show his weakness. He'll explain more exactly why he does this later. But I think part of the reason is that suffering is actually an integral part of his ministry calling. It's an inseparable part of his apostleship. Now, why would I say that? Because remember when Paul left Jerusalem and went to Damascus? And when he was on his way to Damascus, Jesus met him there on the road, and he was blinded by that, by seeing that bright light. And then he was told to go to Damascus and wait for a guy named Ananias. And then Jesus told Ananias, "Go heal Paul." And Ananias said, "Wait a minute. This is the guy who came here. He even has letters so that he can arrest us all. He came here to mistreat us, and you want me to go talk to him and even heal him?" And Jesus answered him. This is in Acts 9, verse 15 and 16. "But the Lord said to him, 'Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel.'" So he's going to have to go and he's going to teach the gospel. He's going to tell Gentiles about me. He's going to tell even kings about me. And he will tell Israelites, Jews, about me as well. Then he says, "For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So part of his calling, part of his apostleship is suffering. And what is Paul doing here in these verses? He's defending his apostleship. But in boasting about these weaknesses, these things that show his weakness, he claims to have suffered a lot. In fact, of many of his experiences, even one of them, many of those single incidences could have killed him. And yet, he's still alive. So he has faced death and survived many times. Of course, some might hear this list and say, nah, that can't be true. One man can't survive all that. One man wouldn't go through all that. They may accuse him of lying. So Paul confronts that right off the bat, right up front. He says, I'm not lying. He's telling the truth, and he says that God knows it. In other words, he's again calling on God as his witness. It's like taking an oath before God saying this. He said, God knows that I'm telling you the truth. I'm not lying. But all in all, suffering is part of his ministry. And if he has to boast, he's going to do it in a way that they least expect. And they may not totally even understand at this point. But he'll explain. Verse 32. Let's keep going. Verse 32. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. This is another time of trouble that he had, and this is possibly the first time he was persecuted for Jesus. This is when he was in Damascus, and they wanted to arrest him. And so they were looking for him. They were watching for him. He had to hide. And then he had to sneak out of town. And when he snuck out of town, he couldn't even do that on his own. He needed help to do it. This just displays how weak he is. See, they had to put him in a basket, and they lowered him down to the ground outside the wall through a window. So this event is actually significant to the current situation. Remember, when Paul went to Damascus, he had something that he was carrying with him. Remember what it was? He had some letters. Letters of commendation, similar to the ones that the false teachers carry. But then what happened? When Jesus was on his way to Damascus, when Paul was on his way to Damascus, he met Jesus. And he found out that he wasn't as strong as he thought he was. He wasn't as correct in his thinking as he thought he was. And his weakness became very evident next to the power of God. You see, Paul left Jerusalem to go to Damascus. And when he did, he was proud, and he went with the full approval of the Jewish leadership. When Paul weakly left Damascus, he left in humble weakness and with the full approval of God. Let's continue reading. Chapter 12, verse 1. He says, I must go on boasting. Though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. So he's still uncomfortable with boasting, but he feels he must continue now to talk about visions and revelations from God. He doesn't like doing this, and he doesn't see any good benefit of boasting generally and talking about these things. But given the situation, he concedes and he continues. Verse 2. He says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. And so he says there's a man in Christ, in other words, a Christian, a believer in Jesus, one who belongs to Jesus, who was taken to the third heaven. The third heaven, this is a way of referring to the presence of God, because you have the sky, heaven 1, you have the space, heaven 2, you have the presence of God, third heaven. And so Paul says that he doesn't know if this man was taken there in his physical body or if it was just his spirit. He only knows that the man was there and that God knows the rest. And while he was there, the man heard things. Things were revealed to him, but he's not allowed to repeat what he heard. And so Paul tells us about this amazing experience, but he's a little vague about who had this experience. But he's clearly talking about himself. We know this from the context. You see, what is he doing in all of this? He's talking about things, he's talking about himself, things that he himself has to boast of. And later, he will tell us what happened to him after this event as a result of this awesome experience. The question then is, so why is Paul so vague in the way he presents it? I mean, why not just say, well, this happened to me? Well, there seems to be two reasons. The first is to downplay the bragging. You know, of all the boasts that he has made, this is the one that could actually be seen as a major strength. This is the one that someone could actually really brag about. But he doesn't want people to think that he's actually boasting about this inappropriately. And so he speaks of a man having this experience in order to distance himself from it and to keep the focus on his weakness, which brings us to the second point, the second reason. In the end, this awesome experience leads to another weakness for Paul. We'll read this in a minute. And this weakness is the whole reason that he's brought up the vision in the first place. He talked about the vision so he could talk about the weakness that came as a result. Verse 5. He says, on behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So Paul recognizes that this experience could be something to boast about. It was an incredible and unique experience. He was taken into the presence of Jesus. And if he did boast about it, it wouldn't be foolish because it was true. It really happened. So he could boast about it, but he says, but I won't. And he repeats that he will only boast of his weakness. Again, this is why he said a man had this experience, in order to distance himself from it, to downplay it. But he had to tell that story in order to get to the next part. But normally he doesn't tell people about this. Normally he doesn't talk about it because he doesn't want people to evaluate him based on this event in his life. Instead, he wants his life and his teaching to speak for themselves. You see, the things that make him fit for ministry and that show that his ministry is authentic is his Christ-like life and the truth of his teaching, not an amazing experience that he once had, no matter how awesome it was. And by the way, this is still true today of any person in ministry. Verse 7. It says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. And so this is why he tells us about this experience. In the end, it resulted in more weakness. So after receiving such a great revelation from God, he could easily become conceited or arrogant. So God gave him something to remind him of his weakness. He gave him a thorn in the flesh. Now, many people have tried to say what this condition was, have tried to explain what the problem was. They've said things like, oh, it was eye problems, or headaches, or gave him a speech disability, or it was an emotional problem like anxiety, or it was attacks from other people, or it was constant temptation, and there's a whole long list. But the truth is, we are not told what it was. So we don't know. And what it was is not important. What it was not the point. The point is that he's been given this problem to keep him from becoming conceited, arrogant. But in talking about this, he also calls it a messenger from Satan. Now, he doesn't explain this, so we don't know exactly how this all played out. But what we can know is that in some way, God has allowed Satan to bring this hardship into Paul's life. And as you read this doesn't sound like a good thing. I mean, it's not something that you would want. But God did this for Paul's own good, in order to remind him of his weakness. But why? I mean, why would God care to remind him of his weakness? And this is where the whole passage has been headed. It's ultimately to remind him to rely on God. Look at verse 8. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. This thorn in the flesh was very troublesome for Paul. It was a real problem. And so he pleaded with God to take it away. He asked him 3 times, but then he got a definitive answer, and the answer was no. But it wasn't just no. God gave him a reason as well. He said, no, because my grace is sufficient for you. This is God saying to Paul, I've got you. I know it's hard, but I've got you. See, God gives him what he needs when he needs it in order to live and to serve him. Even if he's suffering, his grace is enough. And the emphasis here in this phrase is on the word enough or sufficient. In the Greek, it's pushed to the front to emphasize it. It's as if to say, enough, my grace is for you. So whatever the situation, God gives him enough. He gives you what you need to live for him and fulfill your ministry. And you know, we need to hear this. God's grace is enough. He's got you. People will often want the pain to go away, and that's understandable. We want the pain to go away. We want the struggle to be taken away. And we will often beg God to take those hardships away. But sometimes God may be using that hardship to teach you. He may be using it to grow us. And in the meantime, he gives grace. And his grace is enough. He's got you. He gives you what you need. So lean on him. Also, we may need to stop running away from the pain or begging God to take it away. And instead start asking God how he wants to use it in our lives and in the lives of others. Is there a purpose in our pain? We could go back to the Old Testament and ask Joseph that when he got shipped off into slavery in Egypt, right? Is there a purpose in our pain? God can use you in your weakness, and his grace is enough. But God didn't just stop there. He didn't just say, my grace is sufficient. My grace is enough. He also said, my power is made perfect in weakness. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that God's power is ever imperfect or that it somehow falls short. It simply means that his power is fulfilled or brought to full strength in our weakness. The idea is that God's power is fully expressed when he works through weak people. You see, human weakness may keep us from doing all that God calls us to do. Human weakness may have kept Paul from doing all that God called him to do. But God gives grace. He gives everything he needs to do it. And God's power is then displayed in Paul's life when he does it. And so Paul is glad to boast about his weakness, because the fact that he is weak means that Christ's power is present and at work in his life. Otherwise, there's no other way he would be able to do those things. He said, when we are weak, God makes up for it. He makes up for our weaknesses. When we are obviously weak and God works through us, then it is obvious that it was God. It was God's power at work in us in order to do it. When you see something, you say, I clearly can't do this, and yet God gives you the ability to do it, then it's clearly not I who did it. I didn't do it in my own strength, but it was God. So this also means, though, that being weak, not having the best ability, is no excuse to not serve Jesus. We often might say, well, I can't do that. I'm not able. That's good. That's good that you recognize this. Now lean on God and do it. You see, our weakness is not a shortcoming when God is involved. He will use our weaknesses, and his power will be put on display. And ultimately, then he is praised. He is glorified. Much is made of him. One last verse, verse 10. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This is the best perspective. He says, for the sake of Christ, I'll do it. He's saying, I'll do it for Jesus. If it's to live for Jesus, then I'll do it. If it's to tell others about Jesus, well, then I'll do it. If it's in service to Jesus, then I'll do it. If it brings glory to Jesus, I'll do it. For the sake of Christ, I'll do it. You see, life is all about Jesus. And knowing this changed Paul's perspective in life and his perspective about weakness. If it brings glory to Jesus, then Paul is content to live with weaknesses, with insults, with hardships, with persecutions and calamities. He's okay with it. We run from those things. We try to avoid those things. But Paul said, if it's for Jesus, I'm okay with it. Anything he suffers or struggles with is fine if it's for Jesus. He doesn't mind being hated and facing opposition if it's for Jesus. He's okay with these things if it's for Jesus, because Jesus gives him strength and the grace to get through it, and through it all to honor Jesus. He says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. When Paul is weak, he's filled with the strength of Jesus. When Paul is weak, God gives him strength to do what he needs to do. And God's power is greater than any human strength that Paul or anyone could have. So when Paul is weak, he depends on God and he is made strong. With God's power working through our weaknesses, we can be more effective in serving Jesus than by using the greatest of our own human strengths. We need to recognize this. We need to recognize that we are weak and that God helps us when we are weak and when we rely on him to work through us. When I am weak, then I am strong. Real strength comes from God, not ourselves. So we can talk about strengths, and we all have strengths. They're good things. It's a gift from God. We all have strengths. But it's God's strength that we need. And so we live and we serve Jesus in humble reliance on him. And his strength is put on display in our lives as he works through us and through our weakness. So are you willing to say, Jesus, use me. Even in my weakness, use me. Whatever it takes, I'll do it. I'm fine with it. If it's for you and if it brings you glory.